This is ISOW's expository course on the book of Esther, and we are now on lesson 5. We'll be in chapters 2 and 3 of the narrative, and I have titled this lesson, Promotion and Plotting. So in lesson 4, for quick review, we found that our heroine of the story, Hadassah, is an orphaned girl, but she's not carrying a victim spirit, and this is due to her adopted father. Mordecai has taught her how to rely on God as her father, and Mordecai has prepared Hadassah for the second crisis in her life, the one when she is gathered into custody against her desire and will, and prepared for a one-night stand with an intimidating king, likely over 20 years her senior, and widely known for his rage. The spirit of sonship on Hadassah, Mordecai's instruction in the change of her name to Esther, and this favor on her life from the moment she enters the harem. This favor gets King Xerxes' attention, and Esther becomes queen, Mother Persia. This is followed by feasting, likely a way for Xerxes' ego to override the humiliation of the conclusion of that first 6 months of feasting. We also noted that Esther's relationship with King Xerxes was one-sided, Ahav. The extraordinary oppositeness, the mirroring of what Esther carried, producing in Xerxes a hesed, or benevolent kindness. He had a zealous desire for her. But this ardor is not to be misconstrued with Western views of romantic love. This is a powerful person showing kindness to a lesser, and it's far from reciprocal in nature. So with that reminder, let's pick up now in Esther chapter 2, verse 19. When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. Well, an unspecified period of time has passed. It appears that Xerxes' desire towards his opposite has waned. Though Esther is reigning as queen, though she is Mother Persia, virgins are again gathered into custody. Imagine being the parents of these girls. A queen was already chosen from the first round. This time, these girls will simply numb King Xerxes' emotions with pleasure. They will be concubines. So remember that this is contrary to that history of the Medes that we talked about, with 5 wives and a very small harem. Theologian R.G. Branch describes this second gathering of virgins as an earthquake for Esther. Surely, Esther at least felt empathy, right? She'd been through it. But additionally, she realizes that though she still has the position of queen and Mother Persia, and with it the king's favor, his desire is shifting. It is also likely that Vashti and Esther know each other in the harem. And while Vashti was stripped of title and property, she was a family member, and as noted earlier, she was likely simply banned from the king's presence and official duties. So did this influx of virgins make Esther remember Vashti's sudden change of position and wonder about her own future? As we move on in verse 20, something really interesting caught my eye. I want you to notice as I read that this is a different location than we heard about a little bit ago. And as I've read the book through, I don't know why I'd never thought about this. But Mordecai, it says every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. This is not where we saw Mordecai at first, at the king's gate. So we're going to go back and look at an image. I put 2 arrows there on the screen. So where Mordecai initially worked was to the right there whether you're on the PowerPoint or your outline. It's titled The King's Gate, and this was an access location to the entire palace complex. I did read, it looks small on here, but I did read that access gate was the size of a typical Western 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. So don't think of it like a little guard tower. It was a huge facility. And then to the left, you'll see an arrow, and this image, you'll see the last thing that's titled, other than what I added, says inner court. That would have been the access to the king's hall and likely the court where Xerxes received his guests. But to the left, there was a green square that had no label on it, and I added one. And that is supposedly, or what some suppose to be, the court for the women's quarters. And this is where we find Mordecai pacing. The bottom edge of the building where you see all the little tiny squares, that would have been the harem, where the girls' rooms were. So let's put some puzzle pieces together. We know that Mordecai's ancestors came to Susa with the elite from Jerusalem. We know that several generations later, Mordecai has some type of palace access. We know that the King's Gate is a massive building, larger than many modern homes. And biblical scholars are in agreement that Mordecai wasn't just hanging out. He couldn't have had access to the court of the women's quarters if he didn't have some kind of official position. So he may have been a judge who listened to grievances brought by people at the gate. He might have been a guard or a court official who controlled people's access to the palace and the grounds there. My thought is maybe their job kind of entailed all of the above. Maybe maybe the reason this building was so big is that these officials would listen to a grievance and then they would know what to do with that, whether they were relaying a message or escorting somebody under guard into one of the courts. He was probably in some capacity, some kind of guard to the court system. And this position at the gatehouse obviously gave him access to the front of the court of the women's quarters, because that is where he checked daily regarding Esther's welfare and when it was her turn to have a night with the king. And I really just had to wonder, did his fathering heart check for news before and after his work shift every day? I did find a Jewish insight. My heart wants to cry. Can you imagine you guys, the dads that are listening, can you imagine knowing that that was the fate of your daughter and you couldn't even talk to her, and just that the heaviness? One of my friends who is an intercessor who stays up through the night, as she was listening to me practice that, she said, really, Mordecai portrays the image of a prophetic intercessor. The way he checked on her and fathered her, that he was praying over her welfare and coaching her in that. And it was just such a beautiful picture. So I did find in a Jewish encyclopedia a statement that said that Mordecai was...
We will resume this teaching after a short message from International School of the Word.
This teaching is one lesson taken from a full course on ISOW.org. If you are enjoying this video, we invite you to check out the full course in the links below. For the best value, try our All Access Pass. At just $99 per month, you can access thousands of hours worth of high-quality, world-class teaching. To check local pricing in your country, visit ISOW.org. For more great teachings like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel and follow us on our social media platforms.
Now, back to this teaching from International School of the Word.
Appointed to the royal court at the request of Esther. So it does stand to reason that after she became queen, she must have been able to promote him in some capacity from just working at the king's gate to having access to the court. So while she couldn't personally access her dad, she got him closer and accessible at least to her servants. According to Jewish sources, Mordecai was also on the Sanhedrin. And as a member of that, some people say that he knew 70 languages. And whether that 70 is metaphorical and it's an exaggeration, the truth is that Mordecai linguistically knew a lot of languages. And that is what really would have served him well in this capacity at the king's gate and in the royal court. And it's an obvious setup for what happens as we keep reading. So let's move on to verse 21. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers became furious and sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles, in the presence of the king. So remember that humiliating setback that Xerxes had in his unsuccessful Greek campaign, and remember his philandering when he fled for safety, and remember how he depleted the wealth of the empire due to the war and his building project, and then remember how that went on to heavy taxation, and remember that he's known for this raging bully. All of that may account for the conspiracy uncovered by Mordecai while he was sitting in his royal capacity. The Talmud teaches that the gatekeepers had no idea how many languages Mordecai spoke, or at least that he knew theirs, as they whispered to each other in their plot in their native tongue. We know from history that Xerxes' mother, Atassa, had set up this queen's court for herself, and it could be that the tradition for the court continued in the reign of Esther, and that is how Mordecai's information was reported to her in her court. But in other words, it was reported in an official capacity. Esther, in turn, takes the information to Xerxes and commends Mordecai for exposing the plot. And since the matter is actually investigated, we can assume that the matter was taken to Xerxes at the king's court, again in an official capacity. So you have to remember our context. Medo-Persia is all about law and order. So doing things in a court setting would have been really important in the empire, and therefore to our understanding of this part of the book. These two eunuchs were found guilty and they were hung. And because this was done at court, it went into the official records and Mordecai got the credit. So, you might assume that because it was investigated and recorded at court, that Mordecai even himself could have been interviewed. And if so, this would have given Xerxes a personal encounter with Mordecai, and this may or may not have been the first time the two have met. It really does say something to me about the relationship that Xerxes and Esther do have with each other, because Xerxes obviously took the report from his wife seriously enough to have it investigated. He does seem to trust Esther, and this is going to serve her well as she endeavors to counter an evil plot. All right, let's take a little bit deeper look into Mordecai's name. We already know that it was associated with the Babylonian god Marduk. And according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, in rabbinical literature, the Aramaic form of his name means pure myrrh. As we know, a person's name does tell us something about them. And this is what we know or are familiar with when it comes to myrrh. It's one of the gifts that the wise men brought to Jesus. It is first mentioned in the Bible as one of the principal ingredients in the anointing oil that was used in the tabernacle. One of its primary uses is as a perfume, and that may be why it was used for embalming. In the Far East, myrrh was also used for healing, and it was mixed with wine to produce gall, which was customarily given to those condemned to death by crucifixion, which we saw it offered to Jesus on the cross. And it produced an insensibility. So metaphorically, if I take all those pieces together, this is how I see myrrh playing into Mordecai's destiny. Mordecai's fathering healed Hadassah from carrying any orphan spirit, and in so doing, he anointed Esther for her assignment. In just a bit, we will see him anoint her for her ultimate destiny. When a spirit of death hovers over the empire, he's going to do the same thing he did for Esther, only in a much larger capacity. And in a play on words, when the fiend in this storyline has the gall to betray the king and the Jews in the empire, Mordecai's guidance to Esther will help her numb the evil man's sensibilities before his death. As we move on to chapter 3, I want you to remember our context. Mordecai has uncovered an assassination plot. After investigation, the co-conspirators were hung. King Xerxes' life was spared, and it strikes me, this is so fascinating, Mordecai helps co-author the book of Esther, right? And here he just keeps it to the facts. He almost minimizes his role in this. It's kind of like he could have written, oh, by the way, I saved the king's life. Was this humility? Or maybe it was just the influence of his official role at the king's gate and in the court. I wonder if, Mordecai was a person of so much integrity that saving the king's life for him was just all in a day's work. We're about to meet now the evil villain in this narrative. And as the story plays out, because of this really factual, humble reporting of Mordecai's role in saving the king's life, it makes me find what comes next really particularly ironic.
Thank you so much for supporting our ministry. If this has blessed you, please say a prayer for us. And if you would like to give, we have 3 ways that you can do that. You can give online at isow.org/donate, or text the word give and the amount to 423-225-9022. That's 423-225-9022. You can also give through the mail at ISOW, 340 Paul Huff Parkway, Northwest, Cleveland, Tennessee, 37312. Thank you. God bless you, and may the Lord multiply your seed. Now back to this teaching from the International School of the Word.
If you contrast and compare Xerxes the fool and Mordecai the father with the fiend we're about to meet, there's just so much irony here. So let's move into chapter 3, and we'll start with verse 1. After these things, King Xerxes promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. Chapter 3 begins with the phrase, this is really important, after these things. This is meant to remind the reader that this promotion of Haman took place after the assassination attempt on Xerxes' life. The first thing to note is that Haman rose to power. Suddenly, the second in command is not a family member. The council has shifted. I really wonder if Xerxes held a grudge against the family members who talked him into the ridiculous decree when Vashti was banished. Did he hold a grudge for being talked into the Second Persian War, where he was so significantly humiliated by Leonidas and the Spartans? After his brother Macestes' revolt and after that first assassination attempt, did Xerxes distrust people in the family system? And was he really just looking for someone who would have his back? First, he took Esther as his wife and queen, and now he sets Haman above the princes, the family members. And because Haman was not a member of the royal family and he had no obvious motive for the throne, Xerxes must have felt safe with this choice. So who is this Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite? Every year, the Jews read 2 specific passages on the Shabbat before a celebration that comes at the end of this book. And during this celebration, the entire Megillah, the book of Esther, is read aloud. The Jewish rabbis believe that this book of Esther will be really important during the millennial reign of the Messiah. And if they're correct, it's likely in large part due to the instruction regarding these annual festivities. So we'll learn more about that when we get to chapter 9. For now, we need to take a preliminary look at the 2 passages that are read the Shabbat before the celebration, because they are a key to understanding this enemy of the Jews who just rose to power. And to understand the first passage, we must look at the story behind the first passage. So you'll find that in Exodus chapter 17. Israel's first battle after they passed through the parted waters of the Red Sea and after they celebrated the defeat of the Egyptian Pharaoh and his army. Israel's second stop is in the wilderness. It's a place called Rephidim, and it is here where the Amalekites started a war with them. You've probably read this story or heard about it. It's where Israel was winning as long as Moses' arms were held up. It's where Aaron and Hur held his arms up for him. And he sat on a rock all day with them till sundown, and then Israel won against the Amalekites. So in reference to that, Moses wrote in Exodus 17, 14 to 16, "Then the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called its name, "The Lord is my banner." For he said, because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So that's the context for these two passages that are read the Shabbat before the celebration that comes as a result of this book. Let's read the first one. You'll find that in Deuteronomy 25, 17 to 19. "Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you were coming out of Egypt, how he met you on the way and attacked your rear ranks, all the stragglers at your rear, when you were tired and weary. And he did not fear God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord your God has given you rest from your enemies all around, in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, that you will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget." The second passage that the Jews read, the Shabbat before the celebration, is a story found in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Due to its importance, the entire chapter is in your lesson handout, and I would encourage you to read it in its entirety. But for the sake of time, I'm going to skip through and highlight a few key verses. We'll start with 1 Samuel 15, 2 to 3. Here we find the prophet Samuel giving King Saul instructions regarding this "you shall not forget" matter addressed in Deuteronomy. He says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Picking up in verses 7 to 9, we read this. "And Saul did attack the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. He also took King Agag of the Amalekites alive and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them. But everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed." If we pick it up in verse 17, we see the dialogue beginning with prophet Samuel's rebuke of King Saul for not utterly destroying. So Samuel said, "When you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel, and did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel? Now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, 'Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed.' Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord?" And Saul said to Samuel, "But I have obeyed the voice of the Lord and gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me and brought back Agag, king of Amalek. I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the plunder, sheep and oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal." So Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, it is better to obey than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king." So apparently, Saul lost his kingship over not completing the assignment according to the prophet Samuel's instructions. Finally, near the end of 1 Samuel 15, we find Samuel talking to King Agag of the Amalekites before he slew him, and pick that up in verse 32. Then Samuel said, "Bring Agag, king of the Amalekites, here to me." So Agag came to him cautiously and said to himself, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. You know, Samuel's statement to the king may actually indicate that Agag's military success was really well known. In verse 20, Saul told Samuel that he had utterly destroyed the Amalekites, preserving only the life of the king. However, this was a lie, because at the end of his reign, the Amalekites were still raiding. The most famous story is that of Ziklag, which had been assigned to David by the Philistine king Achish of Gath. Do you remember when David and his men came back from battle to find that Ziklag had been burned to the ground and all the women and children had been taken captive? This leads us to the first clue about Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. In Arabic, the name Agag or Agagite means to burn. Agag was actually not a name. That's been confusing to people. It was a title. It was a title that meant the flame or the burning one. It was a title given to all of the Amalekite kings, much like you would see an Egyptian leader called Pharaoh. This title was due to the fact that the Amalekites warred with a scorched earth policy, and that's what we saw in that story in Ziklag. Haman is called an Agagite because he was a descendant of the Amalekites. Some say he was a direct descendant of the Amalekite king whom Samuel killed, but I'm guessing that's a lack of understanding of the term Agag, because that was the title for a king, not the name of that king. So whether or not Haman is a direct descendant of that particular leader really is not pertinent. The point is that Haman carried the scorched earth spirit of the Amalekites. The Amalekites were not only the first enemy who attacked Israel in the wilderness, they were also, ready for this, a hereditary enemy. Their ancestor is presumably Amalek, son of Eliphaz, son of Esau. Ooh, this is huge. Contextually, we have to read the book of Esther with the sibling rivalry and the conflict of Jacob and Esau in mind. And this may provide the clue we've been looking for regarding how Haman rose to power. In ISOW's course, Prophetic Developments in the USA 101, there are 4 lessons titled Esau Rising, parts 1 to 4. In them, Bill Cloud makes a really interesting observation about Haman's ancestor Esau. He explains how the Hebrew reveals that Esau had an intimate knowledge of hunting typically done under the cover of darkness in camouflage with stealth. He stated that Esau was skilled at trapping and skilled at the art of deception, both in the field and with his mouth. And that Isaac loved Esau because trapping was in his mouth. According to Hitchcock's Bible names, Haman's father's name, Hammedatha, means, and I'm going to quote, "he that troubles the law." I also found this written as, quotes, "an agitator of the law," particularly spiritual law. So Hammedatha was an agitator or an activist who encouraged others to rebel. The true etymology of the name Haman is disputed. A Babylonian expert thinks that it came from a deity. Another one thinks it came from a Persian word that means alone. Another one thinks it came from a Persian word that means magnificent or illustrious. I'm going to use all of those because it all really fits Haman. So I'm going to take all of that and summarize it this way. Culturally, Haman was a carnal man, like his ancestor Esau, whose intent was the scorched earth policy of completely eliminating something and reducing it to ashes, like the the Amalekites. He lived in an empire that was in love with law and order, but generationally, Haman was an activist who troubled the spiritual law of the land. And personally, it is possible that he was named after one of Medo-Persia's pantheon of gods, the patron god of Susa. He was probably a loner, holding himself aloof, and he was well-known, impressive, striking, and extravagant. Historically, it is said that he was one of the wealthiest men in the city of Susa, which does give credence to him being either the descendant of one of the Amalekite kings or simply due to this scorched earth policy of taking everything during war and stripping it from others. So we're getting a picture of this wicked, evil man, and let's read on. We're in chapter 3, verse 2. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" Now it happened when they spoke to him daily, and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. That word is really key. Mordecai alone. For they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes, the people of Mordecai. So we have a court system that has strict protocols of law and order. And it does seem strange that despite this grave insult, there's no immediate repercussion for Mordecai's refusal to bow to the highest official. I think that's a really intriguing clue, given that the beginning of chapter 3 started with what? After these things. So though Mordecai had been unrewarded for preserving the king's life, Haman knew the testimony in the court. He knew of the deaths of those two eunuchs, the co-conspirators in the assassination attempt, and he knew better than, as verse 6 states, to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So while it was not against Jewish practice to bow to a ruler or to the ruler's representative, I really don't think that Mordecai or Esther needed to spell it out any further to their audience why Mordecai refused to bow to Haman. A Jewish audience would immediately have understood Mordecai's reasoning. The Israelites had an edict for the Amalekites to be utterly destroyed, and King Saul, a Benjamite, part of the tribe of Mordecai and Esther, had lost the throne for disobeying that decree. So while Xerxes may have trusted Haman, Mordecai knew that Haman was from an accursed lineage. Haman lost no time making a list of false accusations and half-truths to present to Xerxes. And here we go again with more propaganda and another marketing campaign. We'll pick that up in verse 7. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman to determine the day and the month until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Many Jewish sources state that because of the diaspora and the destruction of the temple, Haman thought the Jews had lost their exalted status with God. This lottery was intended to find a day of vulnerability. And Jewish sources state that Haman was so excited, he was overjoyed when the lot fell on the date of Moses' death. He really must have thought, the demise of Moses, the head of the Jewish nation, surely a metaphor for the demise of the entire nation. But, I love this, what Haman did not know was that Moses passed away on the very same day he was born, the 7th of Adar. So far from being a date of vulnerability for destruction, it was actually also a date for deliverance. Ooh, one of those fun hidden things in here. Let's go on to verse 8. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. You know, in English, this passage was really confusing to me. So Rashi explains it this way, that when Haman said they do not observe the king's laws, what he meant was that they waste time because of their Shabbats and their festivals. And so they don't perform all the national service. They don't pay all their taxes that the government imposes on all the working people because they take so many days off for their Shabbats and festivities. So this is part of his argument. Carol Bechtel, professor of Old Testament at Western Theological Seminary, wrote a commentary on the book of Esther, and she explained that the phrase translated here as "it is not fitting for the king to let them remain" can literally be translated, "it is not appropriate for the king to let them rest." That makes a lot more sense, right? It's not appropriate to let them rest on their Shabbats and their festivals. So essentially, Haman is saying that the Jews constantly claiming that their laws prohibit them from working is cutting into Xerxes' tax revenue. All of a sudden, it's plain, right? That section was so confusing till I found that out. Remember in lesson 1, I mentioned the repetitive pattern of the Israelites staying too long where they don't belong instead of occupying the territory given to them? In ISOW's course titled Moses as a Prototype of the Messiah, a Hebraic study from the book of Exodus, Bill Cloud points out that Israel's enslavement in Egypt began with taxation. And Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 1:9, that which has been is what will be, and that which is done is what will be done, and there's nothing new under the sun. Haman talking to Xerxes really just reminded me of the serpent talking to Eve in the Garden of Eden. Twisting words, bribing, mixing lies with a little bit of truth. Jesus stated that the devil has been a murderer from the beginning, and he's a master of deception and the father of lies. In Revelation, he's called the accuser of our brethren. And here we see one of his own, twisting words and accusing in exactly the same way as his father, the devil, and his ancestor, Esau. While Jacob and Esau may have had the same heredity in the natural, in the spiritual, they had a completely different bent. And here we see the consequences continuing to play out between the descendants of the brothers. So Haman goes on in verse 9. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. In her commentary, Carol Bechtel also writes about Sandra Beth Berg's homophone theory. In it, we're going to see how Haman lives up to his name, and he cunningly engages a rhetorical trick when speaking with King Xerxes about the Jews. And I'm just going to pause here and say, Matt Foley and I did some research on this because this homophone theory is related to Hebrew, which the book was written in, but Haman would have been speaking probably Arabic to Xerxes. And so Theo's like, I don't know if this works, but then when we looked up the words in the Arabic, it applied. So in say somebody's out there as the Hebrew scholar thinking that it doesn't fit, we did double check, and the theory still fit even with both languages. So in case you don't remember this from English class, homophones are two words that sound alike but are spelled differently, and they have very different meanings. So I'm going to give you 4 common examples. So you have flew, the past tense of the word fly, which means to move in or pass through the air with wings, or you have flu, short for influenza, right? A virus or disease with respiratory and intestinal symptoms. You have mail, letters or packages sent in a postal system, or male, boys or men, the gender with the capacity to produce gametes, which fertilize the eggs of a female. You have overdue, to do or use in excess, or overdue, delayed beyond an appointed time. And one last one, tale, an imaginative narrative or intentionally untrue report, what Haman's doing, or tale, referring to the prolongation at the end of an animal, right? An animal's tail. So this is what's happening as Haman is talking to Xerxes. He's using homophones, two words that sound alike but have very different meanings. In the context of telling Xerxes it's not appropriate for you to let the Jews keep different laws and rest, it would have been easy for Xerxes to hear his proposal as a word that meant to enslave. If it pleased the king, let a decree be written that they be enslaved, instead of what Haman intended, the other homophone that means destroyed. So these two words sound almost exactly alike, and Bechtel goes on to say, add to this the fact that Haman follows up the proposal with an offer of payment. And Berg's suggestion seems even more plausible. This could explain why Xerxes acquiesced to Haman's plan so quickly, though it hardly exonerates Xerxes, since he would still be agreeing to the enslavement of a significant portion of the population on extremely scant evidence. So orally, Haman's request is sly. It's ambiguous. He camouflages his real intent, but when he writes the decree, he adds to kill and to annihilate, making certain the instructions are extremely clear. This cunning entrapment of Xerxes puts Haman, as Bechtel points out, in the category of evil genius. Ambiguity may abide at the oral level, but once words are written down, they take on a terrible finality. So let's talk about some of those characteristics of an evil person. They're cold. They have a profound lack of empathy. The victim of an evil person is an object to be controlled or destroyed. And this description of evil is evident with Haman because we see that he objectifies both Xerxes and the Jews, and he controls one while setting out to destroy the other. I love to ask weird questions about books and study out answers and research and dig, so another question. How in the world did Haman come out with the amount of $10,000, 10,000 talents of silver? Like, why that particular amount to offer to Xerxes, right? I found an explanation from a Jewish source that I thought was kind of interesting. So the count of Jews who came out of Egypt was 600,000. The average lifespan was 70 years. The required contribution of every male over 25 years of age was 1/2 shekel of silver to the annual communal offering, which was considered, it was their atonement or ransom or redemption of the soul. So I'm assuming by them saying this that they had a required contribution that went on into Xerxes' coffers, right? So if this is accurate, the 10,000 talents was literally the precise value of the Jewish people paying that 1/2 shekel of silver for 70 years based on the count that came out of Egypt. And thus the king would not suffer any financial loss if they were exterminated. That is just evil. Esther 3, we're going to pick up in verse 10. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you. Rabbi Foreman notes that throughout the Megillah, King Xerxes doesn't seem particularly moved by concerns of moral justice or fair play. He doesn't seem particularly concerned about the plight of his subjects. Notice that Haman didn't even name the nation he wanted to obliterate. And the king allowed Haman to do whatever he liked to this anonymous nation. Here, have a ring. Comparing an evil person with a fool, Allender and Longman note that an evil person hates anything human that reflects the beauty and glory of God. Evil delights in destroying and violating God's image in mankind, and we see this in Haman's plan for genocide. Not only the fact that this was an annihilation against an entire people group for the purpose of destroying one man who angered him, but in reality, it was the people group who were set apart to be salt and light. And as Haman had pointed out, their laws are different from all other peoples. So we're going to contrast a little bit, an evil and a fool. I want you to begin to clearly discern how to recognize the difference. A fool is committed to pleasure and satiety. A fool would rather turn his or her eyes away from the reality of evil because, you know what? Facing evil requires an emotional investment of passion. The fool is deeply committed to selective emotional engagement. So we see Xerxes just hand a signet ring to Haman without much of a thought. And notice how casual it all is. Here, take my ring, do what you like, just don't bother me with these trivialities. The king has literally just decreed genocide against an entire people, and he's done it with a disinterested wave of his hand. And so we are left in suspense as we conclude the book of Esther, lesson 5, chapters 2 to 3, promotion and plotting.